present For the Record.
Welcome to For the Record. I'm Naomi Kowles. For 16 months throughout the height of both the pandemic and nationwide civil unrest, Madison had an interim police chief leading the department. Now, after 30 years there and serving a wide variety of roles before finishing as assistant and then acting chief, Vic Wahl is now a week into his retirement. I caught up with him this week to look back at a chaotic chapter in both the city's and also the department's story. If you had known that 2020 would be, well, 2020, would you have taken the interim chief's job?
I would have. I mean, I feel like it was my obligation from where I was in the organization and the time I had on the department, and being the most senior assistant chief, you know, I certainly felt it was a duty and responsibility. Certainly never envisioned that 2020 and my tenure, as short as it was going to be so eventful. But I think it was important for the department to have some continuity during that time, and so I would have, yes.
And I think you had initially told the press when you first took the position, it'll be 7 months, maybe a little bit longer because of, you know, turnover at the Police and Fire Commission. We went for double that. Did you ever consider quitting, ever once, during that 16 months? Did you ever think, wake up in the morning, you're like, I could quit?
Not seriously. I mean, certainly it was a very stressful year, you know, not just for me, but for everybody on the department. There was a lot of challenges, and certainly there were times where I thought, you know, this is not what I signed up for 29 years ago. But, you know, as I mentioned, I really felt an obligation to the department and to the community to sort of provide some continuity.
Did it, however, possibly speed up your retirement? Like, when did you decide to retire, and did, after your stint as interim chief, would you have stayed on longer without that?
I think probably some point midway through my tenure as acting chief, when the timeline for bringing in Chief Barnes became a little more solidified, that's sort of when I more locked in on sticking around for just a transition period to help him get acclimated and set him up for success and then retire. So that was certainly 2020 probably had a little bit of an impact on that, but it's not too far off what my timeline would have been otherwise.
Now, acting chief is understandably a bit of a tough role because you're temporary, and you were very clear that you never wanted the permanent job. But you did identify two goals when you first came in. You said, you know, you told the press you wanted to put in place employee feedback processes and you wanted to implement more critical incident reviews. Did you feel like you accomplished those goals? 1 for 2.
We did institute a critical incident review process, which was one of the recommendations from the OIR report and the ad hoc committee. We put that SOP into place, and we've been doing that process now since about the middle of last year. So I feel like we've taken a good step forward there. The employee feedback process, we literally had a work group put the entire process together, and the first step was going to be training supervisors on how to do it. And the first training, literally we had to cancel the day before. It was right at the front end of COVID and restrictions on gatherings, and so we were very close to being able to get that one in, but COVID prevented the timing of the start, and then the rest of 2020 unfolded, and it just was never a good time. So I know that it's something that's still out there on Chief Barnes' sort of to-do list for him, but that's not something that I was able to get done last year, unfortunately.
I think March 2020 and then subsequently May 2020 reformed a lot of the priorities perhaps for the department. Looking back at your time as you're, again, steering the department through probably one of the most pivotal years it's had in a long time, what do you consider the highlights?
It was as difficult as the unrest was in the pandemic. You know, I feel grateful that we didn't have any employees who died as a result of COVID. Some did. You know, our folks are out still on the front line throughout the early stages of the pandemic when we really didn't know much about it, and our people were out there in harm's way, and we did everything we could to try to minimize risk to them, and I'm grateful that we certainly had some people test positive for COVID, but none were hospitalized or had serious cases. And I'm grateful that as bad as the unrest was, as bad as the rioting and the looting and sort of that episode throughout the summer was, that we didn't have any significant injuries to members of the community or to officers. Certainly there was a lot of property damage, a lot of fires, a lot of things that were not good outcomes, but I'm grateful that there were no fatalities and no serious injuries, and I think that's a credit to some of the decisions we made during those events.
Now, particularly in those first few days of protest, MPD's response drew some criticism from the community. Do you have any regrets with how it was handled?
Well, certainly hindsight is always 20/20, and I think if you look at cities across the country that faced similar unrest, and there was quite a few, and quite a few that deteriorated, into violence and into looting, I'm really proud of what our response was. I think you can literally go from day one to day two, and we adapted our tactics and our strategies. We tried to evolve throughout the course of the summer to be as creative as we could be to get better outcomes. And I think we really changed. If you look at day one till the last few days of unrest that happened in August, there was a significant change in our strategy and our tactics. And I think that made a big difference in how our actions were perceived and how those events turned out.
If you had to give yourself the most honest self-critique possible of your 16 months intern chief, self-examination, if you will, what would be your biggest criticism of yourself for that period of time?
Well, I'm probably my own worst critic, so I have a long list of things that I would have liked to have done better. I think, for me, we have 600 plus employees, and working 24/7 through 6 different districts, and as chief, it's hard to have FaceTime with everybody, and I wish I would have been able to have more one-on-one with all our people. And certainly you mix in the pandemic, and it makes it that much more difficult to sort of have direct one-on-one with everybody who works for the department. That's one thing I would have liked to have done more of. And certainly I wish, externally that we would have been able to make some more inroads as an organization, and me personally as a chief, with some of the groups that were protesting and planning protests.
You've earned yourself a long rest, a retirement, perhaps a vacation in there. Once that's out of the way, what's next for you?
I don't know yet. I don't have any plans. I'm kind of coming into it wanting to take a little time and decompress from 30 years and from, more acutely the last 18 months or so. I want to step back a little bit from policing because it's been such a difficult time to be involved in this as a profession, and kind of just see what, after recharging my batteries a little bit, what the interest level is. And certainly there's lots of opportunities to contribute other than being a chief or a sworn officer, and those may very well be things I look at down the road, but we'll see. Time will tell.
All right. Thank you so much for taking time to sit down with me.
Happy to.